reading in verse 31 and read through verse 40. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. Before him will be gathered all the nations, and he will separate them one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will place the sheep on his right hand, but the goats at the left. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, "Come, O blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we see thee hungry and feed thee, or thirsty and give thee drink? And when did we see thee a stranger and welcome thee, or naked and clothe thee? And when did we see thee sick or in prison and visit thee?" And the king will answer them, "Truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these, my brethren, you did it to me." Now let's give our attention to our brother Chuck, and he's entitled his talk, "The Brotherhood of Christ." Brother Chuck.
Good morning. I was reading a Christadelphian page on the internet where someone was directing our attention to the foreign migrants massing at our southern border. And he indicated that the Bible demanded our intervention, citing Jesus' own words. "The king will answer and say to them, 'Truly I say to you, to the extent that you did it to one of these brothers of mine, even the least of them, you did it to me.'" Do you see a problem here? Jesus is instructing us to care for his brothers, the people that are around him, the people who are listening to his word eagerly, those who are invited to the kingdom, that is, people within the ecclesia. Jesus is not referring to those who have refused God's help, and he's not referring to those who worship other gods. Jesus specifically mentions his brethren. Jesus had 2 days left before he would be killed, and he's giving instructions to those around him. So, do we think he made a mistake? That he was saying it wrong? I think he's saying exactly what he intended to say, because it's the same thing that he said elsewhere. If we look at Matthew chapter 12, verse 46, we see that while he was still speaking to the crowds, behold, his mother and his brothers were standing outside, seeking to speak to him. Someone said to him, "Behold, your mother and your brothers are standing outside, seeking to speak to you." But Jesus answered the one who was telling him and said, "Who is my mother, and who are my brothers?" And stretching out his hand toward his disciples, he said, "Behold, my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father who is in heaven, he is my brother and sister and mother." So, Jesus indicated that his blood relatives, who were standing right outside, were not as close to him as those who were doing the righteous acts that they saw God doing. This is a clear division, a distinction, a line drawn between those who are God's and those who are not. His family, at that moment, was opposed to his work, but later they would repent and they would end up supporting him. So today we have people who supposedly know their Bible saying in a public forum that we should treat strangers in a foreign country the same as we treat Jesus' brethren, while the scripture, explicitly referring to brethren, is being misapplied to people outside the ecclesia. The result is that there is no boundary line. There is no difference recognized between the ecclesia and the world around it. Is that where we are today? Has the world around us suddenly become godly? Or has the ecclesia suddenly become more worldly? And what difference does it make? Well, God gives us finite resources. He gives us a specific number of days and hours. He gives us a specific number of dollars. If we throw them away, if we dispose of them foolishly, we won't have anything left to give when it's really needed. Just as parents live within their means to give their children what they need when it's needed, the mothers and fathers of the ecclesia manage their resources to give to members who are in need. Matthew 24, verse 45 says, "Who then is the faithful and sensible slave whom his master put in charge of his household to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that slave whom his master finds so doing when he comes. Truly, I say to you that he will put him in charge of all his possessions." These plain words say that by managing the house of God well and providing for members of the household at the proper time, these fathers and mothers will be praised by God as faithful and sensible, having proven themselves capable, and God will put them in charge of his affairs. If we practice these things and teach others to practice them, we will be blessed. Jesus intends for us to be responsible adults in every part of our lives. Perhaps you could read right past the words in this verse, but once you understand the pattern, we see that it's woven throughout the New Testament. Let's take a look at Galatians chapter 6, verse 10. "So then, while we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, and especially to those who are of the household of faith." Yes, the Bible teaches that we should do good to the people that we meet. That would apply at work. Are we good to people at work? At home, are we being good to people at home? On the road, are we good to people in the car? In the store, are we good to people at the store? And wherever we go. But it comes with a reminder to pay special attention to those who are of the household of faith. We are committed to doing good, but it's not simply random acts of kindness that we execute on our own behalf in our own time. There's a preference given to the household of faith. But why? Because when you support a minister of the gospel, you participate in his good deeds. You share in his work. You're part of what is happening. As we read in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, "Now, brethren, we wish to make known to you the grace of God which has been given in the churches of Macedonia. that in a great ordeal of affliction their abundance of joy and their deep poverty overflowed in the wealth of their liberality. For I testify that according to their ability and beyond their ability they gave of their own accord, begging us with much urging for the favor of participation in the support of the saints. And this not as we had expected, but they first gave themselves to the Lord and to us by the will of God. So we urged Titus that as he had previously made a beginning, so he would also complete in you this gracious work as well. So in Corinth, it was viewed as participating in the support of the saints. And they did so gladly, not only according to their ability, but beyond their ability, because they wanted to be a part of what was going on. We might not have a particular skill, or maybe we're not prone to travel, but we can participate in the work of others by offering lodging, by providing meals, by giving financial support, or by simply encouraging those who are actively doing the work. And on a personal level, we have the same kind of obligation that applies to our own families. 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 8 says, "But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever." So part of living a faithful life, part of doing what is good, is to provide for our own household, to provide for our own family. Only an unbeliever would leave his own in need while he moved on to something else. First, we take care of our families. Then we take care of the saints. And after saving a little, we are free to do good in the world. This is how we're called to be. And we're called to teach others these principles of living. Ephesians 2 verse 10 says, "Now therefore you are no longer strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God." So, when Paul writes to the Ephesians, he says that you are members of the household of God. So, just like you take care of members in your own house, you take care of members in the household of God. If there was any doubt, the household of God is sitting all around you. Now, why do we do this? Well, first, and the part that's easy to prove in an exhortation, is that the Bible is explicit that we are to do this. It's what we're told to do. If we live according to the Scriptures, that's one of the things we will be doing. But more than that, isn't that really what love is? It's one thing to say, I have a concern, and that concern is proof of the love in my heart. And it's another to say, are you okay? It's enough to say, were you able to find a job? How are you healing after that surgery? It's more than just concern. It's being willing to act and taking action. That's what love in action would look like. 1 Timothy 3:15 says, and this is Paul writing to Timothy, "But in case I am delayed, I write so that you will know how one ought to conduct himself in the household of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and support of the truth." So when Paul was giving us written instructions, it was to help us in conducting the affairs of the ecclesia. But what about Paul? We have some verses that Paul wrote that indicate that he was eager to give to the poor. Well, one of those is in Galatians chapter 2. Galatians 2, verse 7. But on the contrary, seeing that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been to the circumcised, for he who effectually worked for Peter in his apostleship to the circumcised, effectually worked for me also to the Gentiles. And recognizing the grace that had been given to me, James and Cephas and John, who were reputed to be pillars, gave to me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, so that we might go to the Gentiles, and they to the circumcised. They only asked us to remember the poor, the very thing I was eager to do. So, Paul is describing how it was that they divided the work, how Peter would be going to the circumcised, to the Jews, to preach, and Paul would be going to the Gentiles to preach. However, when they were given the right hand of fellowship, when they were publicly commended as members of the Brotherhood, and they were about to go out preaching the gospel, they only asked us to remember the poor, and that was something that Paul was already eager to do. Well, from Acts chapter 11, we know that Paul and Barnabas had already been collecting money for the saints in Jerusalem. The persecution of the saints extended not only to just being left out of the temple, but being excluded from employment by the Jews, which meant it was almost impossible to earn a living. Paul's eagerness about helping the poor was not about social class. It was about supporting the saints in Jerusalem. The first Christian ecclesias, the very first groups that heard the gospel, the very first groups that were named after Christ himself, those who were at the very center, in the beginning of what would become Christianity, were in severe distress. They were excluded from the temple. They were excluded from the alms that the Jews would give to support widows and orphans, and now they were excluded from employment. Essentially, it was becoming impossible for them to live under these conditions. And Paul was justifiably concerned about them, just as he was concerned about all the ecclesias, but in particular those that were being persecuted and those where they were suffering. 1 Thessalonians 2 verse 14 says, "For you, brethren, became imitators of the churches of God in Christ Jesus that are in Judea. For you also endured the same sufferings at the hands of your own countrymen, even as they did from the Jews, who both killed the Lord Jesus and the prophets and drove us out. They are not pleasing to God, but hostile to all men, hindering us from speaking to the Gentiles so that they might be saved, with the result that they always fill up the measure of their sins, but wrath has come upon them to the utmost." The Jews were violently hostile to the reformers God sent to them, to the point that people like Paul could not even walk among them. The first Christian ecclesias were in trouble, but Paul never forgot them. Paul was also familiar with his Old Testament. He quoted from Psalm 112 and 2 Corinthians 9, reading 2 Corinthians 9, verse 8. "And God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that always, having all sufficiency in everything, you may have an abundance for every good deed. For as it is written, He scattered abroad, He gave to the poor, His righteousness endures forever. Now He who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will supply and multiply your seed for sowing and increase the harvest of your righteousness. You will be enriched in everything for all liberality, which through us is producing thanksgiving to God. Well, the verse he quoted in Psalm 112 says, He has given freely to the poor, His righteousness endures forever, His horn will be exalted in honor. The righteous man has always been a generous giver, but there is no virtue in merely dispersing wealth, since you can find people in any casino spending lavishly, and any corner tavern can have people throwing money around, but there's no virtue in it. Just as an aside, I worked with a consultant who was barely 30 years old, who was diagnosed as having cancer. And realizing that this could be a threat to his longevity, he then figured, well, why am I earning all this money? And proceeded to become a big shot at the casinos. He was the kind who they would greet by name when he came in. He had his gold card. They would ask if he would like a meal and treat him to a first class dinner. They would invite him to spend the night, and they would pay him for his room. He was a big shot up until his diagnosis changed, and suddenly he was in remission. Now he was kind of sad because he had a girlfriend and he was going to get married and they were going to buy a house and all the kind of things that encumber us as we grow older. But now he no longer had that fortune that he made, and he was kind of sad. But that's how life works sometimes. The only praiseworthy giving is for the relief of distress, where you get nothing back for yourself, and that disbursement which is directed wisely for that purpose, because even men hold the righteous in high esteem and in honor. Now, the word here for poor is penis, which does not occur anywhere else in the New Testament. It means moderate and honorable poverty, whereas in classical Greek there's a completely different word, tochia, which implies disreputable pauperism and begging. Well, anybody who spent time downtown has heard every story in the world, and after a while you recognize that you've heard this same line before. Man I worked for, he was my manager, grew up in Rogers Park, and one of the scams that they did in the city was to walk down the street carrying a gas can, and then you would tell people your car ran out of gas up the road and you didn't have any money, could you please have $5 for gas? Well, if people are going to work in the morning, they give you $5 and drive down the road and they don't see you again. So you can do that twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, 6 times. You can make $50 in a morning. Not bad considering that those people are going to work and you're not. Well, it was only a couple weeks later he was driving down the same road and saw the same guy with the same gas can doing the same line. So he had to explain to him, look, the gas can scam only works when you're in one neighborhood for the first time. If you're going to do it again, you've got to go someplace else because people get to know you. So here was a guy who's going to be a scam artist and didn't even know how to do the scam. That's life in the city. So there are people who are poor but completely honorable. They're working for their daily living, but in fact, they're barely making enough money to pay the next bill. There are people who are poor and have done everything right. On the other hand, there are people who are poor that we think of, like with the people downtown, who basically would rather do drugs all day. And if you want to take them to a program that will help them clean up and get a job, they don't want to live in the shelter because there are rules that would prohibit the kind of things that they want to do. So the Greek language makes a distinction between honorable and dishonorable men, either of which may be poor. We might think of what we call the working poor, who are doing everything they can. So there's a rough correspondence between our distinction between a drug addict running scams on the street and the working poor. Romans 15 verse 22 says, "For this reason I have been prevented from coming to you, but now with no further place for me in these regions, and since I have had for many years a longing to come to you whenever I go to Spain, for I hope to see you in passing and to be helped on my way there by you, when I have first enjoyed your company for a while. But now I am going to Jerusalem, serving the saints. For Macedonia and Achaia have been pleased to make a contribution for the poor among the saints in Jerusalem." Yes, they were pleased to do so, and they are indebted to them. For if Gentiles have shared in their spiritual things, they are indebted to minister to them also in material things. Therefore, when I have finished this and have put my seal on this fruit of theirs, I will go on by way of you to Spain. I know that when I come to you, I will come in the fullness of the blessing of Christ. So Paul was concerned as always for the Gentile churches, but he never forgot the Jewish churches in Jerusalem. But as to the poor as a social class, Paul would have known what was written in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 15 verse 11 says, "For there will never cease to be poor in the land. That is why I am commanding you to open wide your hand to your brother and to the poor and needy in your land." The land, of course, is God's land, Israel. There would always be some falling into poverty, but they were fellow Israelites and brethren. It was a duty to uphold another family in Israel. They might be poor today. They might be slaves today, but on that 7th year, the slaves would be free. They might have lost their family inheritance. The land no longer belonged to them. But in the year of Jubilee, they would get that land back. So a family in Israel might be poor, but that's just for now. They lived in hope for that year when all would be restored, their freedom, their land, and they would stand again as a family in Israel. The word translated needy is stronger here than the word used for poor. The poor are in humble circumstances, and the needy are actually in want. Now, the King James translation is interesting here. It's translated as "thy poor" and "thy needy," which are expressions teaching that we are members of one another. We may not pass by our poorer brethren and have nothing to do with them. God calls them ours. Thy poor man, thy needy man. The words are both singular in Hebrew. These are individuals. These are people in the promised land, people in Israel, not a social class. And the foreigner, the alien in the land, had now entered Israel, the promised land, and there he would quickly come to know the living God who is the God of this land. As we read in Deuteronomy 10 verse 17, "For the Lord your God is the God of gods and the Lord of lords, the great, the mighty, and the awesome God, who does not show partiality, nor take a bribe. He executes justice for the orphan and the widow, and shows his love for the alien by giving him food and clothing. So, show your love for the alien, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. So what can we say in conclusion? The world around us has a very short attention span. One day, it's the border crisis, and then it's the flood victims, and then it's global warming, And then you try to follow up and you say, well, whatever happened to that? And it turns out nothing changed very much, but the world just moved on. That's the opposite of caring. That's the opposite of love. Love takes care of its own. Love follows up to see that people are all right. Love cares that brethren are in trouble, family are in trouble, people in front of us are in trouble, and we ask, and we're willing to help. That's why we have an obligation to support ourselves and to support our families, to manage our time and our money well. We need to make sure our family is provided for and taken care of. Marriage and family is training for caring for others. When push comes to shove, we need to put our family first. Our lives, and at times, our lives have seasons. And at times, our family needs more. In particular, if somebody is newly married, they need to spend more time with their spouse, learning to work as a team. When somebody has a new family, they need to focus on the needs of the child. They need to consider how they're going to provide for the rest of the year. When the children leave, we have more time. In many cases, we have more money. That means that we can execute these things farther out of the circle, starting with our family, out to the ecclesial family, out to the needy in the world. We must give preference to brethren who are doing the work of preaching and teaching. And we need to support brethren in need. Jesus started the work. That's what we see Jesus doing. That's what we see his clear teaching is that his followers are to do, to pick up the work of preaching and teaching that Jesus started. And he told his followers to continue this. When we support preaching and teaching, we become a part of the work. Whether it's providing a support system or whether it's simply words of encouragement, there is always something we can do. And there are still brethren in need in this world. There are still brethren in poverty. There are brethren whose lives are at risk. We recognize them as our brethren, and we have the ability to help them. And finally, we must do good to those we encounter every day. Doing good is only constrained by our time and our money. Now, if God has blessed us beyond our needs, beyond the needs of family, beyond the needs of brethren, then by all means do good. But the real challenge has always been with those people around us with whom we interact. It's easy to love people far away and more difficult to love those right around you. We are part of the household of faith. We are distinct from the people of this world. We have a special status before God that marks us as his people. And Hebrews 3 verse 5 tells us, now Moses was faithful as a servant in all God's house, testifying as to what would be spoken later. But Christ is faithful as the son over God's house, and we are his house if we hold firmly to our confidence and the hope of which we boast. A Bible-based fellowship means we share beliefs, hope, and worship with those who believe and hope for the same things, and those who know God according to the Scriptures. 1 Peter 4, verse 17 says, "For it is time for judgment to begin with the household of God. And if it begins with us first, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God?" So, if we practice these things and teach others to do so and show them by our example, we will do well.